the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project at the University of Washington in Tacoma. I'd like to welcome everyone back for another installment of Working Together, our fall seminar series. And when we decided on this title, we really wanted to underscore the value of solidarity, to kind of emphasize the power and the understanding that comes when we stop thinking individually and start working together. And tonight's presentation certainly spotlights that aspect of the seminar, but I think it also, it speaks to another kind of togetherness, and that's the togetherness that occurs when we make the unification between theory and practice, when we move from ideas to actions. When I'm teaching, I often tell my students that, if I'm doing it right, if we're all doing it right, the study of labor history, class mobilization, resistance, social justice, these are more than just intellectual exercises. When we learn about the work and the sacrifices of those who came before us and what they were willing to risk in pursuit of a better world, there's a real ethical imperative there. I think, we're compelled to act. However, one of the biggest challenges facing us today, as students, as scholars, as activists, is kind of figuring out, where and how to make that transition from ideas to action. How do we ground what often feel like abstract theories in material practices that can actually, implement change in the world? How do we come together as a class? And, once we're together, where do we actually begin the work, right? And I think that these are some of the questions entertained in our guest Michael Reagan's Intersectional Class Struggle, Theory and Practice, which was published earlier this year by AK Press. This is a book that, blends history and theory in its analysis of American labor, from colonization to contemporary Amazonification, right? It's a really an amazing, expansive work. And in the process, it addresses how, culture, economics, ideology, and consciousness all contribute to this dynamic construction of class. And I think it also provides valuable insights, I know for me, on how to kind of bridge that divide between academics and activism. And I think we're, extremely fortunate tonight to be joined by a panel of folks who themselves have straddled this divide, people who educate, who activate, and who are actually out there doing the work of organizing. So I will introduce our panel. We have Michael Reagan. He's a historian and a lecturer at the University of Washington's Robinson Center for Young Scholars. He's also an adjunct faculty at Seattle College. In addition to Intersectional Class Struggle, Michael's writing has appeared in the Boston Review, Truthout, CounterPunch, Perspectives, and South Seattle Emerald. And joining Michael, we have Calvin Cheung-Miaw, who is an assistant research professor of history at Duke University, joining us from the East Coast, who specializes in intellectual history and social movement history. His writings have appeared in the Pacific Historical Review, AmeriAsia Journal, In These Times, and Organize Upgrade. And actually, prior to graduate school, Calvin organized hospitality workers in the Silicon Valley. And then finally, we have J.M. Wong, who is a Seattle-based author, activist, and nurse, who, in addition to writing about movements, bordered spaces, and diaspora, covers the logistical supply chain, connections that transcend prison walls, and crossing over to the ancestral realms. JM is a policy advisor and a community organizer with the COVID-19 Mutual Aid Seattle, Free Them All Washington, and Fight APIC AG Family. So please join me in welcoming our fabulous panel with us this evening. For being part of the seminar, I'm just really excited to provide a platform for all of your work. And I'm really excited to promote Michael's book, which I thought was absolutely excellent. We've decided Michael's going to sort of present the work, and then Calvin and JM will provide some responses. And we've had quite a few questions submitted ahead of time from my students, and then we'll just hand over the balance of the time to the kind of free-flowing conversation Labor Solidarity Project seminar attendees have grown accustomed to. So again, thank you so much for joining us, Michael. The stage is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Alex, for the invitation and for organizing this series. The Labor Solidarity Project has been really awesome. Just the events this quarter are great, bringing so many great people together. I'm really honored to be part of that list. And I'm also very excited to be joined by Calvin and JM, who are longtime friends and comrades, and I don't get to see as often as I would like to, and here we are together, so I really appreciate the time. Thanks also to the Bridges Center, too, before I forget. Bridges Center made this possible, and really grateful to Andrew and everyone over there. I'm going to try to keep it short, so I'll talk a little bit about the interventions that the book is trying to make, and then I really can't wait to hear from Calvin and JM. And then hopefully we can open it up to hear from all of you who have taken your evening to come and join us and think about intersectional class struggle together. Well, first, actually, let me share my screen. Cool. Can everybody see this? Nice. Okay, so if you've been paying attention even just a little bit in the last few years, you may have noticed that we live in a class-divided society. One might even say class-determined society. If we look at any of the major problems that we're facing in the 21st century, from the pandemic to climate change to police violence to a whole slew of issues, these are all profoundly influenced by the question of class and class struggle. And we can just take one at random. The reason why we're all meeting on Zoom tonight instead of meeting face-to-face, the COVID-19 pandemic. And it becomes pretty evident that questions of class and economics are very clearly at the forefront of how the pandemic is unfolding. Just in the last year, there have been newly minted 493 billionaires worldwide. Globally, billionaire wealth has grown by $5.5 trillion in the last year. In the US, that number is 1.9 trillion, which in some kind of great cosmic irony is exactly the same number that they're debating in Congress around the infrastructure program and the Build Back Better Biden administration campaign. That's coming from soaring profits for web tech infrastructure and pharmaceutical companies. There have been, in fact, dozens of pandemic billionaires in the pharmaceutical industry alone, with profits for the major vaccine manufacturers soaring in the last year. Those profits are being made through public assistance to try to distribute those vaccines through very necessary public health measures. But the problem is not everyone is getting access, and the distribution has been highly illegal, unequal. This is especially true if we think about it on a global scale. The wealthy Western countries are stockpiling vaccines, while many of the poorer countries of the world struggle to get access. If we look at, for example, vaccine distribution on the continent of Africa, not even 5% of the people there have been vaccinated. If we look at some of the poorer countries there, like Burkina Faso and Chad, just a fraction of a percent have had access to the vaccine. This means that the African Union goal of vaccinating 20% of their population by the end of this year is most likely not going to happen. And part of the holdup is that the vaccine companies are maintaining private property restrictions. They're maintaining their patents on the formula and manufacturing process of the vaccines that they have for COVID-19 distribution. This core question, the ownership of those patents, Oxfam International estimates, has led to public health efforts being 5 times more costly than they need to be, placing access to vaccines for poorer countries out of reach. Meanwhile, it's leading to astronomical profits for companies like Pfizer. In the second quarter alone of just this year, Pfizer has reported $36 billion in revenue. They are forecasting additional tens of billions of dollars in revenue over the next 2 years. The distribution is not just unequal in terms of property relations and class, but also in terms of race and gender. In the United States and elsewhere, men are more likely to die from the virus than women, in a phenomenon that's not actually very well understood yet. And globally, Black and brown people are much more likely to die and become infected than white and Asian counterparts. This is true even in the same country. So for example, in Brazil, Afro-Brazilian peoples are dying at a rate 30% higher than white. In the United States, Black and indigenous peoples have a mortality rate that is 1.5 to 2 times higher than the rest of the population. What we see emerging over the course of this pandemic then is a multi-layered, complex relationship of class, race, and gender, empire, colonialism, and other factors that are impacting the public health and our potential for survival against the virus. In addition to age, other leading factors here in the US of infection and mortality are job status, that is, those who are deemed to have essential jobs and could not work remotely, and health insurance gaps, access to health insurance coverage, also leading indicators. In a racially divided and patriarchal society, these have disparate impacts for people of color and for women. So I picked COVID to demonstrate the importance of thinking about an intersectional class analysis in the phenomenon that are just right in front of our eyes that we're experiencing day to day in our own lives and in the news cycle. But we could have picked almost any social issue to see a similar pattern emerging, from homelessness to climate change, domestic violence, police violence. All of these issues are profoundly determined by class as much as they are determined by race and gender. We can also think of empire, citizenship, colonialism, ability as all co-determining the social problems and phenomena that we see before us. The book emerged, Intersectional Class Struggle, emerged out of trying to think about how do we understand this complex mess in front of us? How do we make better sense of it, both to understand in a scholarly way, but also to inform our struggles in the streets as we fight for liberation and to end these forms of oppression that we encounter, and in the case of COVID, literally to help save people's lives. Unfortunately, much of the conversation, I think, around class, race, and gender is dichotomized in public discourse. In a lot of the interpretations of the Trump election, for example, the leading competing explanations for why Trump became elected have to do with contests between whether race or class were more important in the process of the Trump phenomenon. I think those types of questions really miss the point and are doing us a disservice when we think whether it was race, class, or gender that brought Trump to power. The obvious answer is, of course, all of them. And we have to figure out a language to think about how these pieces interrelate or intersect together. What the book tries to do, or what I started to notice when I started to do research for the book, was that thankfully there was a tradition of struggle coming from working class people for the last 2 centuries, from the origins of industrial capitalism right up to the modern period when we think about contemporary struggles, that recognizes the intersectionality of all these different factors and attempted to struggle against them holistically. I started to call this tradition the intersectional class struggle tradition. And the more I began to think about it, the more I saw it popping up everywhere in working class history and in contemporary politics. I'd like to spell out just a few of the components that I think are important in defining this tradition of intersectional class struggle. this isn't going to cover everything in the book. I'm just picking a few that I think are important for us to think about together, and maybe we can use to inform our conversation afterwards. But these are a few that I think get at the core of how I was trying to define the intersectional class struggle tradition and what I saw in social movements from the past that developed these practices and these ideas. Those three core ideas, I think, are around materiality, if I can use a fancy academic word, culture, and intersectionality. Materiality here just means thinking about economic forces, in particular, the tradition of historical materialism that's coming out of Marxist thinkers from the 19th century. Culture, in terms of the development of cultural studies in the 20th, from people like Stuart Hall, and I would add E.P. Thompson. And intersectionality coming out of Black feminist thought and movements of Black women in the United States and elsewhere. I'm going to talk about each one in turn, if that's okay, and then we can try to bring them all together when we think about what solidarity means in relationship to all of this at the very end. Okay, so materiality. From almost the very origins of industrial capitalism, working class people began to question and challenge the forms of exploitation and oppression that they found in their working conditions. In these new industrial factories, they were working long hours, often in dangerous workplaces for low pay, and they were questioning the new social relationships that were emerging around wages. A common refrain was that with wages, workers were not seeing the full recompense for the work that they were doing. They were putting in work in the factory and receiving a wage, but that profits were being skimmed to the top from the owners of the businesses that they worked for. One of the biggest critiques was that workers were not selling the finished good that they made at the end of the day. They weren't selling a tangible object. They were selling a piece of themselves, their time and their labor to their employers. Marx would highlight that what they were really selling was their labor power, their ability, effort, energy to work day to day. When labor markets emerged to set the prices of these wages, workers sold the value of their labor on the markets determined by supply and demand. That is, large numbers of workers reduced the price they could charge at the companies and had a deleterious impact on people's standard of living. These values set in markets were partially set by supply and demand, but also, as we'll talk about in a second, by cultural considerations of people's value. Those deemed less worthy or less valuable in society, like women, or immigrants, or people of color, could demand not as high a wage as others. This act of selling their labor time on markets, early workers started to call wage slavery. And the more astute among them noticed that what they called a permanent antagonism was emerging. This idea of a permanent antagonism comes from a 19th century labor organizer, William Silvis, who thought that between the wage and property, between profits and what people were getting in their paycheck, there existed this unending tension. Employers wanted to make more money. They could do that by paying people less. Working people who wanted to increase their standard of living could only get that by biting into people's business owners' profits. This is a relationship of hostility that's a core part of thinking about class struggle. And it's a hostile relationship that extends from the workplace itself into the rest of society, from the politics that we see developing in the 19th century and into our own day, to questions of public policy and social good, to struggles at home and in communities around questions of social wage, standards of living, cultural struggles. It's a profound intervention that workers of the 19th century were making. The other material aspect of intersectional class struggle, I think it's important for us to think about is property. And thinkers at the time, like Proudhon and Marx, saw property as the core piece of this relationship of struggle. It was, in fact, ownership that enabled working people to be excluded from the necessary things they needed to live. That exclusion was arbitrary and based on power, and not reflective of the contributions that working people were making to society. This sets up a process of exploitation and exclusion that is baked into the relationship of private ownership and workers' movements, that ones that I talk about in the book, from English and Welsh coal miners to the Lowell mill girls in the early textile factories in the United States, all came to see this as a form of what they called wage slavery and saw property as a core part of the problem of their condition of labor. The second part that I would like to talk about, that I think it's important to understand as it relates to intersectional class struggle, is culture. And this came from workers' movements in the 20th century as they tried to understand why it was so difficult to build solidarity across workers. If all workers shared the same interest around opposition to wages and property, there are literally millions, now hundreds of millions and billions of working class people. Why can't we just do away with the exploiter class and begin something new? This is a struggle that came from the problems of organizing on the ground. It came from the problems of trying to unite white and black workers, trying to think about pink-collared labor and women who were segregated in tiered labor markets, trying to think about the exclusions of immigrant workers in the 19th and into the 20th century. Turns out it's much more difficult to unite working class people than on a purely economic basis would predict. And so thinking about the ways that culture, consciousness, experience, influence, and shape how people think about capital and labor exploitation became extremely important questions indeed. One aspect that I think it's important to think about in a cultural respect is the practice of labor markets that we saw earlier, where having people sell their labor, a portion of themselves. But I think we also need to think about labor markets in terms of their cultural formation, their cultural construction. So for example, workers sought to elevate their status in the labor market by restricting access of other workers to those labor markets. They could do that through racial exclusions or gendered exclusions. They could create standards around citizenship or other types of access to political rights that prevented whole segments of workers from getting access to jobs. They could therefore increase the scarcity of their own labor and raise their wage. And one thing that helps facilitate that process, and certainly that labor markets reinforce, is cultural standards of racism that workers can use to divide working people. I would say this is not all coming from workers, obviously. Employers have a very long history of fostering these types of divides, that racism has been used routinely as a wedge to make organizing more difficult. But I think it's more complex than just something nefariously imposed by employers. It's part of the cultural fabric of work and exploitation that we need to think about if we want to overcome. We can see this in historical practice too, all over the place. If we look at Samuel Gompers, who was the first president of the American Federation of Labor, his opposition, for example, to Filipino workers entering the country and joining labor unions in the period of the American-Philippine War is just one example, but there are dozens of others. Cesar Chavez, for example, also sought restrictions on immigrants that I think should trouble how we think about the history of the labor movement, and there are a whole other series of examples of this: racial exclusions, gendered exclusions, and others. So rather than recognizing a shared interest of working class people and oppressed workers, the history of working class movements show us these types of divisions being used to keep people from practicing solidarity. These kinds of cultural and material divisions are fostered by bosses, but it is partially coming from this culture as well. Okay. The other piece that I think it's important for us to think about, and I think that really helps us understand how important culture is to intersectional class struggle, is the question of articulation. This is an idea that comes from cultural theorist Stuart Hall. He's a Jamaican-born British cultural theorist. And his basic idea is that while questions of class formation and class interests might be universal, they develop in different ways in different historical contexts and different locations. So the idea that a shared class interest can always bring working people together is made much more complicated when we look at the specific historically contingent conditions that people encounter. These are questions that are informed by certainly what happens in their workplace, the type of labor that they're doing, but also their personal experiences in their communities, with their families, their access to citizenship, migration, the ways they identify, the kinds of religious beliefs that they have, the books that they've read, and the TV shows that they watch. All of these factors, Hall tells us, create a moment of articulation of class formation, racial formation, gender identity. And in order to think about how class struggle plays out, we have to necessarily think about all of these other factors as well. These things are synthesized into people's experience and consciousness, but they're also kind of embedded in the deep fabric of culture that people carry with us, often unquestioningly. So therefore, while we all experience class and class struggle in our daily lives, at work, and even in our home, in the political realm, we all experience them differently. Class is mediated by the race and gendered experiences, the identities and cultures that we have and those that we don't share. They make us profoundly different in important ways. And Hall's concept of cultural articulation can help us think about that difference when it comes to understanding contemporary organizing or thinking about the contemporary cultural wars, for example, as an important part of class struggle. The last idea that I want to talk about is intersectionality. This is an idea that comes from the Black feminist movement, and it's been articulated, I would say, most clearly in the last 30 years, but some would argue that this idea has been present in Black women's organizing for decades before, if not centuries. And there are two core ideas here that I want to point out. One is the intersecting oppressions, from which the theory takes its name. The other is the question of difference, which I think it's important for us to think about in relationship to questions of class. Many of you are probably familiar with intersectionality already at this point, but the idea most simply is that forms of oppression intersect in how people experience exploitation and oppression in people's identities and in the very structure of society. That is, the power developed from labor exploitation supports forms of racial exploitation as well. I think in the example of labor markets discussed above, we can see this. The labor market is a core piece of social structure that governs our society today is at the same time making class formation happen, as it is making racial formation happen, as it's making gender formation happen at the same time. So the idea of intersectionality is that these forms of oppression are fused. We all experience them. We just experience them in different ways. And this is the second idea of Black feminist thought and intersectionality that I think it's very important to highlight and discuss, the question of difference. This idea, I think, is best put forward in Patricia Hill Collins' book, Black Feminist Thought, but you can find it elsewhere in the Black feminist tradition as well. This is an idea that Collins was trying to put forward by saying there is no monolithic Black feminist thought, Black feminist position, singular Black woman, but in fact, there's a whole diversity, divergence, difference, contest within Black women themselves. There's no essential Black woman's experience. There are instead many multitude of different Black individuals who encounter and experience oppression and exploitation in different ways and come to different conclusions and ideas, develop different sets of politics about what that means. She's highlighting this to get away from essentialist arguments about what racial or gendered identity means. But it's interesting to note that she frames this within a context of Black feminist thought. She still sees the category of Black women as an important category because of the kinds of structural forms of power that they encounter and need to struggle against, and that even within that difference, it still makes sense to talk about Black women as a political and social category. I think so too for class issues. I think that notion is extremely helpful in thinking about the experience of working class peoples. There is no singular, essential, unified, and universal class experience, but instead a whole variety of different experiences that make the working class diverse, complex, contradictory, even. But nonetheless, working class as a category remains important. Class issues are still with us and before us. We still live under capitalism. Our labor is still exploited. We still need to think about working class sets of interests. So just real quick, by way of conclusion, I think there are a couple just quick takeaways that I'd like to highlight that I think are important, not just how we think about this, but how we organize. The first is that there's no singular class issue or class struggle. And so we have to think about building solidarity between different movements and different perspectives. It means we have to put difference in the forefront of our organizing and try to work with and through that difference and not eliminate how important we are as individuals and different segments of oppressed groups. It means that our struggles against racism and sexism and empire, I think, necessarily have to be anti-capitalist if they want to contribute to movements of liberation. We can't accept kind of simplistic slogans or superficial changes around white supremacy, but we have to attack the root of these structures as they present themselves to us. And those roots are entangled in a long history of capitalist exploitation too. There are a couple other takeaways that I want to add, but I think I'm going a little bit long. So I would just want to say that one thing I think it's important to highlight about this is the notion of solidarity itself. Solidarity is a very old idea in labor movements. You might say it's at the very origins of workers' struggles here and elsewhere. And solidarity is in fact not a simple idea. Solidarity is not about recognizing sameness and engaging in struggle based on that exact identical position. It's about the opposite. It's about recognizing that difference and still finding a common cause to fight together around shared points of commonality. Simply, and if only, because that's the only way we can build power to challenge many of these structures that we face ourselves with. In the book, I think there's it actually comes from Mike Honey, who's a historian at UWT. He has a book called Black Workers' Experience, where he talks about one remarkable person, Clarence Coe, and his experience organizing in the South, attempting to fight capitalist exploitation and forms of white supremacy. Coe thought about it by demonstrating that white and Black workers in the South may be different, but that we were all in the same boat, as he said, and that we need to figure out ways to come together to challenge these structures that, in fact, oppress all of us, only differently. I think that's a good model for us to think about. And as we move through the 21st century, this essentially is our task. There are many very severe problems that we face, but solidarity provides us a way forward through the morass and many of the reactionary policies we see before us. Our task as activists and scholars then is to think about how we can better organize together, how to build solidarity across difference, and how we can begin to transform these systems of oppression whose time it has been to exit this stage of history. Thanks very much. That's all I have. And I can't wait to hear your questions and hear what Calvin and JM think about this.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And for the members of the audience, if you have questions, feel free to add those to the chat board. We'll kind of circle back to those after our respondents provide their responses. So we'll go ahead and throw things over to Calvin.
Thank you. Thanks to the Labor Solidarity Project for hosting this. Thank you, Michael, for writing this book. Let me officially congratulate you with great pleasure. We really don't have a lot of books like this, which go into so many different radical intellectual and political traditions with a great deal of care and judiciousness, but also really aspire to make the book useful for activists, in particular working class activists. It's really an important contribution, I think. Now let me, I'm gonna say a little bit about just what I appreciate, and then a few questions and maybe disagreements that I emerged when I read the book. And I'd just like to start with the last chapter of the book. Also, if you haven't bought it or borrowed it, this is what it looks like. Buy, borrow, steal, download, get your hands on it somehow. So the last chapter of the book is on practice, and in it there's a very compelling picture of the feminist movement in Chile, which strategically united struggles in different sectors of society. Quote, the basic theory of the movement's sectoral strategy, Dr. Reagan writes, is that working class people are engaged in different sectors of struggle, for example, housing, workplace struggles against prisons, and so on. Feminist and anti-capitalist movements that bring these different actors and struggle together build working class power across difference, unquote. So in other words, we get to fundamental social transformation when we're able to weave together all of the different really existing and on the ground struggles that are in motion across society. And I think that this picture of weaving together diverse struggles is also a metaphor for how the book as a whole works. We get a pretty wide tour of history that spans from Bacon's rebellion in the late 1600s to abolitionism, to farm workers in the early 20th century, the South African anti-apartheid struggle, the Arab Spring, the Spanish Civil War, and a couple of glimpses of the Lowell factory militants that was particularly, I think, exciting for me to read. I think they that partially comes out of some of Michael's original research into the factory struggles there. And what we get is a sense of how these struggles have produced an intellectual tradition that understands liberation in terms that are fundamentally different than the ones that carve out race and class and gender and sexuality and other categories as distinct and in some sense competing for dominance. And I think we get this approach because of the way that Michael starts the book, which he didn't talk about in his presentation, but I think is really just fantastic. It's just the idea that the working class is ourselves, right? And so the way to understand class and how class is experienced and how aspirations and visions for liberation are related to class and how class becomes mobilized in political struggle is not to start with kind of abstract theories or models about society, but to examine the wealth of historical experience that we have and to take seriously what working class people have said about those experiences. And I think that this is, just for myself as a historian, just a really great model of what historians can bring to theoretical debates. To really let our conclusions emerge from history rather than try to fit history into theories. Okay, so now let me just move on to some of the questions that I have and possible points of disagreement. So the first thing I want to kind of really press Michael on, not because this is a disagreement, but just how do, so the book is called Intersectional Class Struggle, not intersectional racial liberation or intersectional gender abolition. And so there's a prioritizing of class politics at the same time that through the whole book, it's every time we talk about analysis, we can't prioritize class because class and race and gender determine each other. You can't separate them. And so there's just this interesting tension there, I think, or maybe contradiction between what seems to be this political commitment to having class politics be at the center of our politics and having capitalism be understood as the kind of, if not the name of the social totality, to use kind of the term that you bring up in the book, or the name of the root cause is, as you alluded to kind of at the end of your presentation today, central in some important way. So how do we just help us think through this? Is this just a personal choice because you've got a background in class politics, so that's where you start, but it doesn't need to be? Or is it something deeper that we really do need to understand the social we should insist on capitalism being the name of the system, or something else, right? So how do we think about this? The other question I have comes from the last chapter on practice, which I started with. And so I found myself nodding along to most of the book and most of the examples in the last chapter. But what I also noticed is that most of the things that, if I were going to talk about politics today and the practices that we would want to explore, most of the things that I would want to talk about are not in this chapter. So the practice of building coalitional alliances, or what I would call in left jargon kind of left or united fronts and popular fronts, multi-class fronts, cross-class alliances, how you maintain that and build those fronts while also trying to strengthen the position of the left or build class politics within those fronts. The practice of combining electoral and non-electoral forms of struggle, those were not in the chapter on practice, and it's not a surprise to me. I'm kind of very familiar with kind of how Michael thinks about politics, and that, so I'm not surprised by that, but it does raise a question for me. Is there, is there a practice of intersectional class struggle? Do we think of many traditions of practice? Do we need to think about strategy in addition to practice, right? Do we need to think about strategy in the sense of goals that we formulate, which are short of the abolition of wages and property, some kind of intermediate thing that we aim for, and the social forces that we have to bring together to reach those goals, or can we afford to set those kinds of questions on the side? My own opinion is that I think that intersectional class struggle as both a book and the political tradition would be stronger with a more explicitly inclusive approach to the kinds of political strategies that the left and the working class have taken in their efforts to achieve liberation, somewhat broader than what we have reflected in that last chapter. And thank you, Michael, for inviting me to be part of this. Congratulations again, and I'm looking forward to hearing from JM and the discussion.
All right, I can go. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this. Thank you, Michael, for writing this book. Michael and I met maybe a decade ago, I don't know, more than a decade ago, doing class struggle work, Seattle Solidarity, organizing and unionizing at UW. So it's really beautiful to see like a lot of the experiences and inspirations now here in the book. And as a communist myself, I'm really grateful that you centered this book around class struggle. And being in Seattle today, I don't know if folks here are from Seattle, but it's just been pretty heavy. I think people are seeing the election results. And, you know, basically a few abolitionists were running for city council positions, and they got defeated by just law and order candidates. And one thing that has struck me about this conversation around class and how it plays out in our contemporary moment, you know, in this conversation around abolition, is the definitions of public safety, right? And so much of Seattle, liberal Seattle, is happy to talk about race, but then cringe the moment you talk about private property. And so the people that they end up electing are, you know, the cops and the candidates that will define public safety as a defense of private property, rather than, I think, what a lot of us imagine public safety to be, which is the safety and well-being of working class people, and a lot of them homeless and displaced folks. And for me, one of the projects of doing the abolitionist work in the city, in the region, and also being a communist, is also thinking about how do we bridge the language of abolition and the language of communism and class struggle. And one of the definitions that have really stood out to me is Ruthie Gilmore's definition of racism, when she says, you know, racism is state-sanctioned vulnerability to premature death. And I'm someone who's trained in occupational health nursing and environmental health nursing. And for me, when I think of state-sanctioned vulnerability to premature death, I think of workers and occupational health hazards and places that people live, right? And which is obviously racialized, gendered, and how race, class, and all these identities that we have, we don't just leave behind the moment we clock out of work. We carry those health hazards with us when we go home and be with our families or walk the streets. So a few other things that came up to me in reading this book, I have to admit, I have not finished it, but so I'm sorry, but you know, a lot of the stuff that I have read does resonate with the projects that I feel like we have been part of. One of the central questions is, what does class unity look like? Is this still a worthwhile project? And I think this brings up the question of difference, and you know, Calvin's question of centering class is, you know, there's been so many failures of class unity where it's been class reductionist and erasure of differences. Like, is that still a worthwhile project? And here in Seattle, one of the things that we have been trying to do is to, and for me as someone who is Chinese living in Seattle, is the way in which an entire, like I think a lot of Asian folks, an entire race has been given this like class identity, right? Of like the model minority, of just this collapse of all the class differences within the Asian community into this middle class, upward mobility kind of class identity. And for me, as someone who grew up in Asia and really seeing just, China, 1.3 billion people, factory of the world, and so much variety of class experiences. And as someone who organizes in Chinatown, and especially with massage parlor workers, just seeing the experiences of Chinese workers who are not articulated in mainstream media, who are not articulated in many Asian American circles as well, and thinking about what does it mean to have unity between working class Asians and Black folks who are fighting the prison industrial complex, right? And how do we come to terms with, and how do we analyze the different positions that we play within the capitalist system based on our nationality, race, gender, and geography? And that has been a project, I would say, in the last 7 to 10 years in Seattle. We've been trying to build with workers in mainland, this is pre-COVID, and also people who are incarcerated behind in cages here in the US, and thinking of, what does it mean that here a lot of folks of color are seen as a surplus population? That's the role that people play in capitalism in the US versus the factory of the world. People in China, the working class in China really being exploited, right? That's the main role in capitalism. And how do we overcome this siloing, this fragmentation of experiences? And I really am heartened by like the magic of working class interactions, like that people have different cultural connotations, different cultural experiences, which you allude to in your presentation earlier. But I feel like when working class folks come together, there's just, I'm not trying to romanticize it, but in my experiences working as a nurse, as a CNA in nursing homes, at Starbucks, is just when you bring people together who are experiencing similar conditions under a really frustrating work schedule, there's a lot of unity and a lot of culture that's being created on the spot. Thank you for highlighting COVID and just how the experience has been for folks in the US and also globally. I think one of the ways in which COVID and class experiences has really struck me is just the gaslighting of all of us, right? But especially of workers. And I'll speak as a nurse of this, and that's Striketober. There's a lot of nurses who are now out on strike, but this whole lifting up of nurses as these heroes who are helping the nation, valuing people's lives, whatever. And then that really stark contrast with the fact that we are not compensated materially. Our safety is not centered. And I work at Harborview. It's a major trauma one hospital in Seattle. And we just had our union contract. And it was a terrible contract. And it's really depressing because, the gaslighting of a cultural lifting up and valuing of our lives, but in actual material reality, just, business as usual. The third thing that I wanted to highlight is how do we imagine class struggle that in a way that doesn't fetishize commodified labor, that doesn't fetishize professional labor or craftsmanship. And I say that as someone, who is participating in mutual aid work, participating and really witnessing a lot of spontaneous community responses to 911. These are folks in community who are just in relationship with people on the streets who have been houseless themselves, but they don't have a job category to label the kind of skills that they have, right? And so much of class struggle is often articulated through organization, through union affiliation, through your job category. And how do we value the labor of deprofessionalized, everyday reproductive labor that's on the streets, right? That actually keep us safe. And that's something that's been really pertinent to me in terms of thinking about, post George Floyd the conversations around alternatives to 911. And in this city, so much of the attention being focused on the city's infrastructure rather than thinking of grassroots existing community responses that are never valued, recognized, or resourced. That's where I'll end for right now. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
I'm so grateful to you both. I really appreciate it. And I have to say, I admire you both. I've known you for a long time, and you guys are both models of kind of, intellectually engaged activists and organizers. And I'm very honored that you guys took time to read the book and think about this with me. And I'm a little intimidated because you're asking very difficult questions that I don't know how I'm going to answer. So I think on the question of prioritizing class, agree with Sharon there. On the question of prioritizing class, it is, I think, a struggle, and we can think about the systems that we engage in and are trying to fight as capitalism or white supremacy or patriarchy, or however we want to name it. But I think the thing that the book is trying to get us to do is to think that questions of patriarchy, for example, are not just about sexist attitudes. The problems of white supremacy are not that people are individually racist, but that there is a structure of power that gives those ideas meaning and in fact helps enact forms of violence, as we see with COVID or white supremacist violence or other things. And that thinking about structure is a very important contribution that gets left out in many of these conversations about race and gender. And I think the piece that working class studies or class struggle can help contribute to that conversation is thinking about those forms of oppression structurally. So thinking about how race is in fact a material question, thinking about how patriarchy comes out of relationships of power and social relationships as much as anything else. And for all of those, what I started to call in the book, the social totality, an idea that comes from Marx, however we want to call it, I think we have to start thinking about that totality seriously, and in particular in its relationship to social structure. So it's a good question, Calvin, and I don't know how to answer it. We can call it capitalism or white supremacy or something else, but that kind of thinking in activist and scholarly spaces, I think, is important if we want to try to challenge some of these things. Not a very satisfactory answer, and one I'm not that satisfied with either. And another call, someone was really pushing me like, why don't you just call it capitalism? That's what it is. Capitalism's always racist. So say that. And to a degree, I think that's true, but I think it's part of what we get to decide as movement people going forward is how are we going to think about naming these things. For the things that are not in that final chapter, yeah, I do think that you are right. And part of what I was trying to show is to let movements develop in 1,000 different ways and weave together the different practices that they're generating and in whatever form that takes. And I think the feminist movement in Chile is a great example. Here's a movement that came out of student movements in the early 2000s from the Penguins, and then the national student strikes that were happening in 2010 and 2011. This gave rise to one of the largest feminist movements in the last decades, with national strikes and shutdowns in, when was that, 2017, 18, and into 2019. And then when neoliberal forms of taking away social benefits, like, for example, raising the fares for the subway transit hit, all of these different elements were able to come together and emerge and lead to a constitutional refounding or rewriting of the Constitution from the dictatorship period. And all of those movements were thinking about social struggle in the streets. They were thinking about workplace struggle with workers. They were thinking about electoral struggle in in a more traditional political realm. And so I do think that you essentially are right, that we need to think about all of those things together. One thing I was trying to highlight there, though, that I think often gets left out, and I'm sure you think about as a union organizer, is that the workplace is a particular site of power. When we run into the obstacles put forward, for example, by Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema around the infrastructure bill, if we rely on the cycles of electoral politics, we're stuck waiting for next year's elections to run a primary and get this person out and try to. If we think about politics more holistically, there are actions that we can take right now to pressure these political obstacles like Manchin and others. And I think we have to think about those things in relationship, and that it's important to build those sites of struggle in our workplace. If West Virginians were to strike, if we all were to strike, if we were to mobilize and demonstrate to demand that they can't take away, well, my personal favorite, free community college. That's the one that I like. When they pulled that out, that was heartbreaking. But free community college, expansion of Medicare, environmental climate change transformations, any one of those, to build in the streets a politics that isn't just around the electoral cycle, I think is important. JM, yeah, I'm completely inspired by your work, and I know how hard you have been working both in your workplace and outside. I think the Pacific Rim Solidarity Project is one that I think is important, but so too for COVID-19 mutual aid, and all the other projects that you're involved in. The one thing that I want to come back to that you mentioned that I think is really powerful is this question of the magic of working class experiences, and how when we bring people together to have discussions across difference, something really amazing happens. And I've seen it in the Seattle Solidarity Network. I've seen it in the union organizing work that I do. And that question of like unity and difference, I think is something that's very important for us to keep in mind, that we are not going to agree, we're not going to become the same, we're not going to, the question of unity as sameness is not a helpful one. And so figuring out how to build that magic in collective conversation, even in a very small scale, is very, very challenging. And I've seen it go very bad sometimes on some organizing projects, but it's very important to keep in the forefront of our mind that building those tethers of solidarity are very important. I think that's all, unless I missed anything.
Excellent. And we do have some questions being posted to the chat board. You can kind of work down the line. Andrew had a question for everyone on the panel. Given the intersectional nature of class struggle outlined so brilliantly by our speakers tonight, I agree. How do we also measure working class power in diverse, non-traditional ways? Can working class power still be measured in traditional ways, like through state power, representation through election victories, or market power through strength of wages? What are intersectional examples of working class power? It's a tough one.
Oof, my goodness.
These are some tough questions tonight.
Anybody want to go first? I'm happy to go first if anybody wants to chime in. I mean, I think one of the things that I was also trying to do in the book is think about a politics of liberation and abolition that has really been absent from working class politics for a long time. That is, initially, as industrial capitalism was unfolding, people were very explicit that the wage relationship and private ownership of what is essentially social institutions of social good, like productive capacities or other ways of organizing labor, is antithetical to human freedom. And it wasn't just socialist thinkers who were talking about this, like Proudhon and Marx, who I mentioned, but leading liberal theorists also. Von Humboldt, for one, is writing about how, property ownership takes away a certain form of dignity from labor, that the work that should be profoundly rewarding and emancipating for us in terms of how we care for each other and how we create the kind of society that we want is instead based on this relationship of power and exploitation. And that relationship just has to be undone at a fundamental level. And so in terms of a measure of working class power, I think those institutions and those social movements that contribute to that degree of making us more free, the struggle of liberation and abolition, is something of a metric that at least I use when thinking about social movements. And so, I think it's a little bit related to Calvin's question about, can we be more broad in how we think about working class movements? And I think it's a fair critique, and he's essentially right. If we're trying to pigeonhole a particular thing that we're looking for, it's not going to work out. But if we accept that there's going to be difference in how people approach struggle, and we recognize and celebrate that difference, and we think about creating movements and organizations that can challenge the structures of power, I think, yes, we should, what are the ones that you mentioned? I think state power and market power are kind of difficult questions because they are themselves forms of exploitation and domination. So when we think about state power and market power, we have to be trying to figure out ways to challenge those very institutions, but it's not like they disappear. Often that means struggling within them in order to try to transform them. So what is an example of this? Oof. Well, a good one that just came up recently for me, I think, is the national general strike in Colombia that happened just this last summer. It was happening at exactly the same time that there were protest movements in Cuba against the kinds of economic restrictions that were coming because of the privations from COVID-19. And those received all kinds of media play in the United States. Cuba is an official enemy, so it's easy to highlight movements that are opposed to the Cuban government. But right across the strait in Venezuela, there were national strikes emerging around exactly the same kind of privations that were being imposed on working people there, and it led to a national movement that brought together students, indigenous peoples, labor unions that were struggling against these forms of exploitation and privation in Colombia. I'm sorry, I said Venezuela earlier, but it was in Colombia. That's an example of building working class power that I think meaningfully struggles against these things.
I think I'll add to that, and this is more something that I'm actively thinking about, so I don't really have anything conclusive, but during the George Floyd rebellion here in Seattle, one of the things that really came to mind was, how many of these youth, these young people who are here on the front lines, and in Chop Chaz, the autonomous zone we had here in Seattle, are actually people who work in the Amazon warehouses, in the suburbs. And I actually have talked to people who were, some of the youth who were traveling, during their off days, taking days off from work, calling in sick to come to the action here in Seattle, right? And then of course, the lootings, or quote unquote, the lootings that were happening, how much of that can be articulated in terms of working class folks taking back their resources. And I think one of the ways that we, I don't know if that's a failing, but if we had worker militants who were in those factories, in those warehouses, and were able to agitate around class, COVID, and what was happening with police violence, the anti-Blackness of SPD, Seattle Police Department. I mean, that could have been, I think, really powerful changes if we connected these different sites of struggle. So I think that was a missed opportunity. I know there were people trying here and there, but in terms of a collective effort and investment of resources, I don't think we saw that here locally.
I don't have anything else to add. I think what the question actually sparks for me is, though, another question, I mean, specifically around reproductive labor or even care work, which is maybe not labor as normally thought of, but just like so much of our way of thinking about the power of working class power has to do with the ability to shut down production or logistics, in the Amazon case, for instance. But is there like a special kind of power that we can think about if we're more attentive to reproductive labor, which is often gendered and racialized? Yeah, that's one further question that question sparks for me.
I have the same question. I mean, it's complicated.
There's another question in the chat board from Robert, who writes, Michael, in your book, you touched on the student strikes in opposition to the bombing in Cambodia, where 4 million students struck, but unfortunately the working class sectors did not join in. Do you have a brief opinion on why this didn't work out, or perhaps an idea about how to prevent that disconnect in the future?
What a great question. I mean, often when asked organizing questions like this, I wish I knew. If I knew, I would be doing it, and we would be building that solidarity, and we could be creating a better future for us all. I do think the Cambodia student strike in the United States, and actually the French student strike 2 years earlier, the May 68 strikes, offer good examples of this notion of articulation that I was trying to get at a little bit earlier. In the French case, May 68 was kind of a mini revolution. The French students were striking in opposition to French foreign policy in Algeria and exploitation of much of the third world, as well as other types of reforms that were being made at the university system, which something for us academics to think about and struggle against together. But their spark was picked up by French workers and spread through working groups within large-scale factories and within unions. And this partially is about the articulation that's happening in France at the time. There's a much stronger left movement there. There are, in fact, left parties that are engaged in a process of cultural struggle, political education, making connections between issues, thinking about popular power together, that had a profoundly different dynamic, different articulation for what we saw in the United States just 2 years later in 1970, when students struck all across the country. It was a nationwide strike. It led to occupations on campuses from coast to coast. It lasted for quite a while, but as you say, didn't spread to working class people in their workplaces. And I think that's partially because there was a different articulation here in the United States. There wasn't the same leftist internationalism here. Many of the unions had made alliances with US state power around anti-communism, both within their own unions and externally in the process of waging warfare and the types of jobs that it created here in Seattle, for example, at Boeing and in other places. And so there wasn't that shared kind of consciousness and cultural understanding that can help make those connections happen. I'm definitely not an expert on this question, and so some people might have a better idea of why those student strikes were not able to spread. But part of it also is that you hear students being demonized as, well, at the time, hippies, obviously, but also kind of as elite, privileged students, young people not given to real forms of struggle. And that's just a consciousness question. That's a kind of cultural articulation that we need to struggle against too. Students are oppressed and exploited, especially now, given the levels of debt everyone is facing. We do have points of solidarity that we can build from.
Could I say something on that also? Because this is a question close to my heart. I think just to really reinforce Michael's point, in the Iraq War case, right, we had an organization called U.S. Labor Against War, which spent a ton of time bringing working unionists from Iraq to come to the U.S. and meet unionists in the U.S. and build solidarity. And they were a major reason why the AFL-CIO came out against the war in Iraq, which was like a historic shift for that federation. So I think like the wrong analysis of I don't know what the, Southeast Asian, the role of the unions in Southeast Asia is like a class reductionist one where it's like, oh, well, these sectors were just bought off. They're like, because all the profits from imperialism then, get paid to these better paid workers, and they're like natural allies of imperialism. But really, like Michael was saying, that's the result of all of the purges of the left from unions after World War II, right? That's the fruits of all of those purges. And then U.S. Labor Against the War comes out of the efforts of leftists who went back into the unions, in the openings happening in like the 90s, right, where leftists then go back into the unions and are able to bring an anti-war politics to those organizations and do the work, right, do the cultural work to actually shift the politics of the union movement.
I think U.S. Labor Against the War still exists. I believe it's called like U.S. Labor Against Racism and War, I think, or Racism and Militarism, but is an important group that I think is doing good work, organizing, working on questions of culture and consciousness that Calvin points to.
I'll also put in a plug for Trevor Griffey's work on the Hard Hat Riots, which kind of teases out the degree to which a lot of that reaction was very much astroturfed too. We've got there's another question here from Sharon, which I think is an interesting one that kind of might be a nice one to wrap on, because it kind of, I think it touches on both the activist and academic side of the equation here. And this kind of gets at like the emotional realities of solidarity. So Sharon writes, would you say fear plays a role in a lack of solidarity? Those who accept conditions for fear of losing their wages, retribution, possibly worse in other countries. And I'd like to sort of dovetail this one to, a question for academics, activists. When I teach my Intro to Labor Studies class, I like to imagine that everybody leaves that course radicalized and ready to work. And I often feel as if I'm at a loss of, in terms of real tangible recommendations, in terms of, where students can begin with this, now that they have this understanding, how do they get involved? So, and how do they overcome that fear, right? To transform things from more of an intellectual exercise to an actual intervention in the world. So does anybody have any advice on how to proceed?
That is such a hard question, because the world is in fact a scary place. It's getting scarier by the day. So I think fear, yes, can propel us in pretty negative directions. One thing I've been thinking a lot, especially in this last year, is the counterpoint to fear around hope, and thinking around hope as a discipline. I think Cornel West talks about this a lot. Hope is a practice, it's a discipline. It's not something you have or don't have, it's something you work on achieving. And so many of the people from the left that I'm really inspired by, from Howard Zinn to Dr. West and these others, really forefront that spirit of hopefulness togetherness and solidarity. And I think that's a really important site of struggle too, and just that emotional realm. How do we keep our heads up when the world seems so bad and so dangerous all around us? But one thing I would say again that I think is important to think about is, much like I was trying to highlight the structure of cultural practices like race and patriarchy, I think we can also think about the structure of our emotional experiences in relation to the type of society that we live in. That when we face precarity because we're an adjunct labor and don't know if we're going to be teaching next quarter, or because we don't have health insurance, or because we don't know what our next job will be, or if we don't know how flooded the labor market will be and what will happen to our wages, that those are structural institutional questions that generate scarcity, precarity, fear, that fuel our emotional landscape. And that if we think about this again holistically as kind of a totality, that's a side of class struggle as well, or anti-racist struggle if we prefer, anti-patriarchal struggle. That's an important site to think about how we approach this world that we're confronted with, and think about our feelings, our fears, our reactions as something that we need to struggle with as well. And struggle against those structures, those institutions that help produce those anxieties.
Excellent, thank you. So Andrew's back on the chat board here. It says, thank you for your thoughts. I guess I'm interested less in missed opportunities or traditional measures, strikes and protests, and long-term institutional bases for power. In the US history, at least, institutions like the New Deal and organized labor are more often than not come with compromises, some huge white supremacy and gender job segregation. Are there institutional bases for intersectional working class power that we can focus on, especially intergenerational, that don't require compromise, or are institutions fundamentally anti-intersectional? Calvin's example of the AFL-CIO's anti-war stance intrigues me.
Oof, Andrew. I don't know if Calvin and JM want to jump in here. I mean, I'm really influenced by Frances Fox Piven writing on the question of institutions. She sees this basic need for social movements to institutionalize power to lead to lasting change, but that the dangers come around institutionalization from beginning to have tied interests with structures of power, maintaining the form of the institution against the interests of regular people, that there's an inherent contradiction in there. And I'm very sympathetic to that view. I don't think that there's a magic bullet, but I definitely think we need to build popular organizations that are as closely embedded in working class people and working class interests as possible. And those can be political organizations like political parties, or community groups like mutual aid societies, or workplace organizations like labor unions, and that they have to be democratic enough to be infused with the spirit of disruption and working class power. And that's but that's hard to come by. I don't know. Andrew's question in the chat is there an organization that's already built that approximates this, or do we need a clean slate? I don't know. I mean, people are certainly trying all the time. In Seattle, there's an organization called Labor for Black Lives that I think was instrumental in doing Black Lives Matter work in the latest uprising. I think there's organizations like what JM works on, and mutual aid, and massage parlor organizing, international solidarity projects like the Pacific Rim Solidarity Networks, local organizing projects like the Seattle Solidarity Network that takes on tenant issues in this housing crisis and also workplace issues. I think there are people who are struggling with this question, but the left definitely is not doing well lately, and these projects are pretty isolated.
I just want to respond to Jolie's question. I had put it on the thread earlier, but maybe it was missed. But gaslighting, I'm sorry, I didn't define it, but it's a phenomenon where the external forces cause people to question their reality, and leads to a lot of confusion between what people are actually experiencing and what they're being told is happening to them. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, and to your question, Andrew, you probably know this, I'm not big on institutions, I'm big on organization, and organizations are hard because so many of our organizations are underfunded, under-resourced, there's no room. I'm learning this, experiencing this as I get older, there's not a lot of quote unquote institutional memory that's being passed down. We're relearning lessons constantly because we don't have the structures of institutions to preserve lessons, to pass on to one another. So that is something I struggle with. I do work for the city and really see how, as quote unquote liberal and progressive as the city is, the people who end up working for the city are really institutionalized. And by institutionalized, I mean like there are certain parameters, axioms that we don't think can be changed. And we're defined by those same lessons that were passed on. And that's, I think, the tension, and I think is a generative tension of how do we build organizations that pass on lessons, but then are not restricted by those lessons and are constantly touched and based on what's happening on the ground. And I think, we talked about the different experiences of class, and I think different trends in capitalism, different manifestations of capitalism based on geography, like the lessons that we have to learn today in apocalyptic United States is really different from what we had 20, 30 years ago. And so keeping our ears to the ground and being open and humble to the self-activity of the working class. Like what happened in Chop Chaz was the working class in action. And it's not named and claimed as that, but I think that is, what does it mean, back to the earlier question someone raised, what does it mean for us to identify those as class struggle moments and to think about unions having to listen and orient to that rather than, perpetuating this division between race, class, social movement. Yeah, and thanks for throwing up the definition.
Yeah, thank you, Clayton. Also, JM, I must say I was really influenced by other writing that you did. I think you did an article a while back on queer liberation as class struggle that was like very, very influential to me, thinking about the nature of class struggle outside the traditional institutions, but in terms of the experience of our everyday lives and what happens in our home life and how we express ourselves. And I think that it's important.
Thank you. That was a pretty outdated piece that it needs to be updated, but thanks for.
It's good.
Well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time, especially Calvin, who I know is on the East Coast and it's approaching 11 o'clock out there. I just, to follow up on that question about fear, I feel like one of the, the way to combat fear is to have these types of conversations and to read these types of books that do actively work to instill hope. There are, folks out there doing amazing work, and plugging into those communities, I feel like is the, that's the work we all need to sort of prioritize. We're definitely in a moment, but I think as JM mentioned, election results like the ones we saw yesterday, certainly don't inspire all that much confidence. So there's a lot to be done. Fortunately, I would say, a book like this sort of points us in the direction of the type of work that needs to be done and the fact that historically there has been amazing work that has been done. So again, Michael, congratulations on this book. It's absolutely fantastic. Go out, get a copy, read it. Calvin, JM, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing sharing your experiences with academics and activism. This was a really fun and inspiring conversation. So thanks again.